At exactly 2:17 p.m., in a quiet suburban neighborhood where sprinklers clicked and birds chirped under a clear Georgia sky, gunshots rang out, shattering the illusion of peace. Children dropped their bikes. Neighbors screamed and ducked. And in the center of it all stood James Carter, a 38-year-old black Marine veteran, bleeding from his leg, hands raised, as assault rifles pointed at his chest. Minutes earlier, he had been fixing his fence. Now his service dog lay dead, his yard torn apart, and a dozen police officers surrounded him like he was a terrorist. The raid had been triggered by a single phone call, made by his own homeowners association president, a man who smiled while James was dragged away in handcuffs. But this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was part of something deeper, uglier, and older than anyone realized. And by the time the truth came out, this quiet neighborhood would never be the same again. James Carter had served 3 tours overseas and seen enough war to last a lifetime. After being honorably discharged from the Marines, he didn't crave applause or medals. He craved quiet. Somewhere he could sleep through the night without scanning exits. Somewhere his service dog, Rex, wouldn't have to flinch at every sudden noise. When he closed on a modest single-story home in a suburban Georgia neighborhood called Brookridge Trails, he thought he had finally found it. The house sat at the end of a tree-lined cul-de-sac, with a white mailbox, a small porch, and enough yard for Rex to roam freely. James had saved for years, worked security jobs, taken night shifts just to qualify. He moved in with only the essentials, a neatly folded American flag, framed photos of fellow Marines, and a worn duffel bag filled with memories he didn't talk about. The neighbors watched him from behind curtains as he unloaded his truck. Some waved. Others didn't. Brookridge Trails was one of those carefully curated neighborhoods, trim lawns, pastel shutters, family-friendly cookouts on Saturdays, and strict homeowners association rules printed in a 42-page booklet. Most residents were retirees, mid-level professionals, or young families. Very few, if any, were black. James was aware of that the moment he arrived. He'd been aware of it most of his life. The first letter came within days. A violation notice tucked under his front door. The flagpole he'd mounted, the same one he'd used at every base he'd lived on, violated visual harmony of the community. He read the line twice. The flag was standard size. The pole was regulation height. Still, the letter instructed him to remove it within 48 hours or face a fine. James didn't argue. He moved the pole to the garage and ordered a smaller mount. Next came a complaint about Rex. Aggressive animal reported off-leash. James was stunned. Rex was leashed 24/7 outdoors and trained better than most people. He barked at loud engines and growled if someone got too close too fast, but he'd never so much as snapped at a fly. James posted, "Service dog, do not pet," signs on his fence just to be safe. Still, another notice followed 2 days later, noise complaint. Dog barked continuously between 3:18 p.m. and 3:25 p.m. He began to notice the pattern. The letters always came signed by Walter Green, the HOA president. A man with a square jaw, always in pressed khakis, who walked the neighborhood every morning with a clipboard in hand. Walter didn't wave. He observed. When James nodded to him once, Walter looked through him like he wasn't there. James tried not to let it get to him. He knew how the world worked. He'd seen worse. Much worse. So he kept to himself. He kept his lawn trimmed, paid his dues, followed every rule. But the letters didn't stop. They just got more creative. Trash bin visible from the curb. Improper lawn edging. Unauthorized vehicle, his 10-year-old pickup truck parked parallel to his own house. On Saturdays, when neighbors grilled burgers and played cornhole on driveways, James stayed inside. The invitations never came. Not that he expected them. He wasn't bitter. He was used to being the outsider. But Rex noticed. The dog whined more often. Restless. He sensed the tension before James ever did. It wasn't until the day James received a formal warning about inappropriate attire that something inside him shifted. The offense? Mowing his lawn shirtless. It was 90 degrees that day, and every man on the block had done the same. But James was the only one reprimanded. The notice referenced a concerned neighbor and cited public decency expectations outlined on page 22. It wasn't about the rules. It was about who they wanted to enforce them on. James started documenting everything. He took pictures. Recorded dates. Kept a binder of every letter, every fine, every small humiliation. He wasn't preparing for war. He was preparing for defense. Quiet, calculated. He didn't yell or curse or retaliate. But his silence wasn't surrender. It was restraint. People like Walter mistook calm for weakness. But they didn't know what it took for James to stay calm. They didn't know what kind of discipline it took to hold his ground with dignity instead of fury. He had trained for this, just not in a neighborhood with roses on the sidewalk and passive-aggressive letters slid under the door. He didn't expect friendship. But he had expected fairness. When he looked out his kitchen window and saw Walter staring again from across the street, arms folded, clipboard in hand, James didn't flinch. He just poured himself a cup of coffee, patted Rex's head, and sat on the porch. Watching. Waiting. Because somewhere deep down, he knew something was coming. And he wasn't going to be the one who broke first. By the second month, the neighborhood's hostility became a quiet routine. James woke each morning to the same crisp air, the same mechanical hum of sprinklers, and the same subtle signals that he didn't belong. No one said it aloud, of course. It came through avoided eye contact, forced smiles, and the way parents ushered their children inside when Rex passed by on his leash. The message was always there, tolerated, not welcome. The HOA letters continued to arrive, each one crafted in polite language that barely masked its pointed nature. One cited the American flag James had remounted on his porch, this time stating that the bracket was unapproved hardware. Another claimed his welcome mat was visually inconsistent with neighborhood tone. It was a plain black mat, stamped with Semper Fi in gold letters. James replaced it with a neutral one, not because he agreed, but because he knew resistance would be used against him. Rex grew uneasy. The dog paced more, alert and tense even during walks. James noticed strange behavior, children throwing pebbles toward the fence, adults snapping pictures of his truck from across the street. On 2 occasions, someone left garbage at the edge of his lawn. Once, it was an empty beer can. The other time, it was a ripped-up flyer that read, "Keep our neighborhood safe." No name, no note, just trash and implication. A few neighbors offered small kindnesses, though never in public. An older white woman 2 houses down quietly slipped a bag of homemade dog treats into James's mailbox with no return label. Another waved once during her morning jog but looked away when her husband came outside. These gestures, while appreciated, felt like whispers in a place that demanded silence about injustice. James tried to ignore it all. He kept records. Every letter, every interaction, every petty accusation, logged, dated, photographed. He installed a doorbell camera. He made sure Rex wore his service vest even on short walks, in case someone tried to claim he was a threat again. Still, the pressure grew heavier. Walter Green remained a constant presence. He didn't shout or insult. He didn't need to. His authority came in fine print and HOA codes. In the board meetings he led with measured smugness, and in the subtle smirk he wore whenever James passed by. He walked the neighborhood like a landowner inspecting his property, clipboard always in hand, issuing judgments that pretended to be neutral. James learned that Walter had lived in Brookridge Trails for over 2 decades and had been HOA president for 15 of them. He was known for keeping standards high, but the complaints seemed to fall disproportionately on new residents, and especially those who didn't look like him. It wasn't just James. A young Latina couple who had moved into a corner unit had reportedly left within 6 months. No official explanation. Just a moving truck and a for sale sign. What made it worse was how normal it all appeared from the outside. The lawns were perfectly trimmed. The houses painted in regulation colors. Kids played with chalk on the sidewalks while their parents waved from porches. On Sundays, lawn chairs lined driveways, and the smell of barbecue floated through the air. Brookridge Trails looked like a postcard. But beneath the surface, it operated like a gated system of quiet exclusion. The deeper injustice wasn't in what was said. It was in the things that were never spoken, never admitted, but always enforced. James knew this type of control. He'd seen it overseas, in occupied zones where rules were used as weapons. Here, it was all paperwork and concerns and community expectations. But the intention was the same, to isolate, to dominate, to pressure someone out without ever getting their hands dirty. One afternoon, a board notice went up near the mailboxes announcing an HOA meeting. The wording seemed neutral, general community updates. But when James attended, he found that one of the listed topics was homeowner conduct and compliance trends. Walter spoke at length about the need for uniformity and respect for neighborhood aesthetics. No names were mentioned, but several residents turned toward James in subtle glances. Their eyes said what their mouths never would. James sat still, expression blank, hands resting on his thighs. He didn't interrupt. He didn't raise his voice. But when Walter mentioned a recent increase in complaints involving a certain household, James raised his hand. The room went quiet. Walter hesitated, gave a fake smile, and said, "This isn't a time for debate, Mr. Carter. You'll have an opportunity to respond formally through HOA channels." It was in that moment that James realized something. This wasn't about a dog. Or a flag. Or a mat. It was about erasure, polite, procedural erasure. He was being worn down not by direct confrontation, but by 1,000 small cuts meant to make him surrender his place, pack up, and disappear. He wouldn't. He knew now what he was up against. And he had no intention of going quietly. The breaking point didn't come with a bang. It came with a letter. A final notice, folded neatly and slid into James's mailbox, bore the familiar HOA letterhead and Walter Green's signature in hard black ink. This time, the message was direct. Due to repeated non-compliance with HOA regulations and documented disturbances reported by multiple neighbors, the board is considering legal action and potential fines exceeding $5,000. Failure to respond within 10 business days may result in further enforcement, including property lien procedures. James read the letter 3 times, his grip tightening with each line. He flipped through the attachments, photographs of wrecks behind the fence, grainy images of his truck parked 2 inches past the painted line, timestamps from fabricated noise complaints, and a log of so-called violations, half of which were laughable. But none of it was funny. It was a pattern now too obvious to ignore, a slow, legal strangulation. The next day, 2 code enforcement officers appeared in front of his house, not with warrants or warnings, but with clipboards and camera phones. They walked around his property slowly, photographing the exterior, measuring the position of his trash bins, noting the height of his grass. James stood silently on his porch as Rex sat at his side, tense and still. The officers didn't speak to him. They documented, nodded to each other, and left. Within hours, the footage surfaced on the neighborhood's private Facebook group. Ensuring compliance for everyone's peace of mind, the caption read, posted by someone named Carol Higgins. Comments flooded in. About time. We all have to follow the rules. I hope the board handles this properly. Only one voice questioned the post, isn't this targeted harassment? That comment was quickly deleted. James made a decision. He began reaching out, first to the other residents who had once looked sympathetic from a distance. The Latina couple who had moved out agreed to speak with him over video call. They told him they left because of constant letters, late-night knocks from HOA inspectors, and whispered accusations that they had too many guests coming and going. Another resident, a white woman recently widowed, quietly admitted that Walter had pressured her into filing a noise complaint against James, warning her that people like that could reduce property values if not kept in check. With names, testimonies, and evidence compiled, James contacted a civil rights attorney from Atlanta. The lawyer was a former prosecutor, sharp and thorough, and she immediately recognized the pattern: weaponized housing code, selective enforcement, veiled discrimination. She instructed James to continue documenting everything, and to prepare for resistance. The next HOA meeting was scheduled 2 weeks later. Word spread quickly that James would attend with legal counsel. The neighborhood murmured with nervous energy. Some believed he would shout, disrupt, or play the race card. But others, quietly, were watching with interest. A few had lived with their own unease about Walter's leadership for years but had never dared to challenge him. James's calm defiance stirred something they had long buried: conscience. At the meeting, the room was packed tighter than usual. Lawn chairs had been added to the back, and even those who rarely showed up, retired couples, middle-aged homeowners, parents of toddlers, had arrived early to get a seat. Walter opened the meeting as always, with a practiced smile and a firm hand on the gavel. His voice was measured, professional. Tonight we'll discuss continued compliance challenges and the board's efforts to preserve the integrity of our community. Then James stood. No yelling. No aggression. Just a firm, steady voice and a prepared folder of evidence. He laid out the pattern of letters, the uneven enforcement, the racial disparities hidden behind bureaucratic language. He shared testimony from past residents who had quietly left after being hounded. He explained how selective enforcement wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. His attorney confirmed it. Murmurs spread through the room. People looked at each other. Some lowered their eyes. Others crossed their arms. But a few, just a few, nodded. Walter tried to interrupt, calling James's presentation off topic, but the board's treasurer, an older man who had remained silent for months, spoke up. Let him finish. It was the first time Walter had been publicly challenged. James didn't beg for sympathy. He didn't ask for favors. He demanded fairness. Equal treatment. Accountability. When he finished, the room was silent. For the first time, Walter had no script. No smug smile. Just a red flush creeping up his neck and hands clenching the gavel. The meeting ended without incident. But the silence afterward wasn't the same. It wasn't the silence of avoidance. It was the silence before a shift. James walked home with Rex that night under the same streetlights that had once felt cold. But now, a few porch lights flicked on as he passed. A couple waved. One neighbor called out, "Thank you for speaking up." He nodded. The confrontation had begun. And he was just getting started. The change came slowly, like a storm cloud stretching across a blue sky. The morning after the HOA meeting, James noticed his mailbox door left hanging open, despite closing it himself the night before. 2 days later, the tires on his truck were slashed. Not all 4, just 2. Enough to send a message without escalating it into felony territory. There were no notes, no witnesses. Just silence, as though the neighborhood had returned to its routine with the quiet consensus that one man had stepped out of line. Walter Green made no official statements. No follow-up letters were sent. But new signs of retaliation appeared where rules used to be written. A sudden notice announced that the HOA would begin enforcing a previously overlooked ordinance requiring all homes to repaint their shutters within a 60-day window. James's shutters had just been painted in regulation color last spring. Now, the shade was declared inconsistent with updated standards. Several other residents received similar notices, but only those who had been seen speaking to James in the weeks following the meeting. Trash collection stopped at his address without explanation. 3 times in a row. After hours on the phone with city services, James learned the HOA had filed a temporary hold on his property due to pending environmental compliance review, which didn't exist in the city code. His complaint to the city was redirected. It's a private neighborhood. You'll have to resolve it internally. The doorbell rang more often now, solicitors with no identification, religious groups that hadn't visited the street in years, contractors claiming they'd received service requests. Each one offered nothing but confusion. None had paperwork. All left quickly when James asked too many questions. One even walked away while still talking, as if the conversation had never been real. It wasn't harassment in the obvious sense. It was plausible deniability made flesh. Late one evening, Rex barked with sudden, sharp intensity. James rushed outside to find the gate to his backyard ajar. Rex's leash had been unhooked from the stake. Nothing was missing. No footprints. No sign of damage. But someone had been there. Someone had entered the space he considered sacred. He checked the camera footage. It had gone offline for 23 minutes earlier that day. When it rebooted, the timestamp had changed. The data was corrupted. He replaced the system the next morning with a hardwired, encrypted model. Whispers traveled faster than evidence. Several neighbors who once waved now turned their backs. Children were suddenly pulled indoors mid-play. A flyer circulated warning about aggressive pets, though it didn't mention any specific incidents or names. It featured a stock image of a snarling German shepherd that looked nothing like Rex. The attorney's advice was simple: keep documenting. File police reports for the vandalism. Report every violation. But James could feel the burden shifting. The question was no longer whether he had the right to stay, but how much he could endure while doing so. He was no stranger to intimidation. His years on the force had taught him to recognize escalation, the point where subtlety gives way to recklessness. When people feel threatened by exposure, they lash out. Not always violently, but with just enough force to make someone think twice before standing tall again. One evening, a city zoning officer arrived unannounced. He claimed there was a complaint about unauthorized home modifications in James's backyard. James invited him in, walked him through the property, showed him the original blueprints and permits. The officer seemed embarrassed, even apologetic. He admitted offhandedly that the complaint had come from an anonymous tip. But James knew better. Anonymous never meant unknown, it meant protected. The next morning, a brick was thrown at his front window. It didn't shatter the glass, just chipped the frame and left a scar. There was no note. No sound. Just the evidence of a hand that didn't want to be seen. James replaced the frame and left the damage visible. Let it speak. He wasn't the only one affected. A young black couple living 2 streets over approached him quietly during a walk with Rex. They said they'd received a citation for excessive noise after hosting a dinner party. No music, no crowd, just laughter and a handful of friends. James offered to connect them with his attorney. They nodded, hesitant but hopeful. That week, someone began leaving dog waste in front of his mailbox. Every day. At the same time. James installed another camera. Caught a teenager doing it on a dare. The boy's father arrived later that evening to apologize profusely. But something in his eyes said he wasn't sorry, it was fear, not guilt, driving him. The storm was no longer coming. It had arrived. But unlike others, James had built his life in weather like this. What the HOA didn't realize was that pressure doesn't break everyone. Some men are forged by it. The balance of fear in the neighborhood began to shift. What once simmered quietly in private messages and silent glances started breaking the surface. It began with a single email, sent anonymously to several board members, CC'd to James's attorney. The message listed past violations ignored by the HOA, real infractions by well-connected residents, some of whom sat on the board itself. Attached were photographs, timestamps, even footage showing double-parked vehicles and backyard renovations with no permits. No names were signed, but the email ended with one sentence: "If you're going to enforce the rules, start with yourselves." 2 days later, another anonymous letter surfaced. This one was printed and placed under doors in the subdivision. It was direct, listing dates when Walter Green had waived fines for his friends while issuing penalties to others for the same violations. It named the board treasurer's son, who had hosted a loud birthday party without receiving a citation. It named a committee member who had built a deck without HOA approval. The final paragraph stated plainly that a pattern of discrimination existed, and it was no longer a secret. Whispers turned into phone calls. Conversations once held behind closed blinds moved to sidewalks and driveways. Homeowners who had once stayed neutral were now asking questions at board meetings. The minutes of past gatherings, which Walter had rarely made public, were now being requested en masse. Requests for transparency started piling up. Walter responded with defensiveness. He claimed the letters were misinformation, designed to destabilize the community. He accused James, without evidence, of orchestrating a smear campaign. But when challenged to release the HOA's financial records and enforcement logs, he stalled. Then, the news broke. A local investigative journalist picked up the story after receiving a folder of materials James and his attorney had compiled. The article didn't just detail James's experience, it exposed a years-long trend of selective enforcement and racially biased governance within the HOA. Past residents who had once moved away quietly were interviewed. Their stories matched in uncanny detail: repeated fines, public shaming, property surveillance, unexplained delays in repair approvals, and forced compliance tactics that seemed to only target people of color. The article went viral on social media. Advocacy groups picked it up. Journalists from neighboring counties began making calls. One headline read, "Discrimination Behind the White Picket Fence, a Quiet War in Georgia Suburbs." What had been a local problem now carried national weight. HOA sponsors began to back out of community events. Vendors canceled contracts. Real estate agents reported hesitancy from potential buyers. Property values dipped slightly, not because of the residents James had been accused of representing, but because of the leadership now under fire. Walter tried to spin the coverage as politically motivated. He called a special meeting to reaffirm the board's authority, urging unity. But fewer than 20 people showed up. Half of them left before it ended. The board treasurer resigned that night, releasing a written statement condemning the culture of exclusion. He admitted that James had been right. The attorney representing James filed a formal complaint with the State Housing Commission. That triggered an internal audit of the HOA's past 10 years of actions and finances. Investigators were assigned. A compliance officer arrived unannounced one morning to begin the process. In the days that followed, Walter's home became noticeably quiet. No cars in the driveway. No porch lights at night. Rumors spread that he was preparing to resign but negotiating immunity from civil action. The board held an emergency vote, without informing residents, to strip James of his voting rights, citing pending litigation. But the move backfired when the vote was leaked and posted publicly by a board member's teenage daughter. Parents in the neighborhood, once afraid to speak, began organizing. Not all were on James's side out of conviction, some acted out of shame, some out of fear for their property value, but the shift was unmistakable. A petition to remove the entire board reached its required signatures in less than 4 days. Meanwhile, the pressure on James didn't let up. One morning, he found graffiti on his garage door. "Go back where you came from" was sprayed in uneven red paint. But this time, 2 neighbors came over with brushes and covered it up. Another dropped off a homemade meal. A kid left a drawing of Rex in the mailbox with the words, "He's a good dog." The illusion that the neighborhood was united against him had finally cracked. The breaking point didn't just belong to James. It belonged to a community forced to look at itself in the mirror. And now, it was time to decide what kind of place it truly wanted to be. The audit revealed more than anyone expected. Over a decade of inconsistencies, missing receipts, and board decisions made without proper quorum filled the preliminary report. The most damning detail wasn't just the money, it was the patterns. Fines issued disproportionately to Black and Latino homeowners. Permits delayed repeatedly for residents with non-traditional family structures. Selective enforcement of lawn and fencing rules. Even personal messages between board members mocking residents were uncovered in archived HOA emails. The Housing Commission issued an injunction suspending the board's authority pending a formal hearing. Walter's signature was removed from all operational permissions. The HOA bank accounts were temporarily frozen. A third-party administrator was appointed to handle daily affairs. Residents received official letters stating that past fines were being re-evaluated and potentially refunded. The shift in power was immediate. Homeowners who had once been silent now stood taller at community meetings. Questions turned into demands. Residents who'd once been forced to repaint, replant, or rebuild began organizing their own internal review committee, one that would ensure fairness moving forward. A newsletter was launched, created by volunteers, filled with updates on the transition, legal steps, and stories of those who'd suffered quietly for years. Walter refused to appear in public. His property was soon listed on a private real estate site under a pseudonym. But by then, the damage to his legacy was irreversible. What had once been seen as leadership was now viewed as tyranny. Former board members began distancing themselves. One filed a sworn affidavit confessing to falsifying citations under Walter's instructions. Another admitted to burying community feedback forms and suppressing calls for more diverse board representation. At the hearing, representatives from the State Commission presented evidence in chronological detail, emails, audio recordings, signed meeting notes. James sat in the gallery, flanked by neighbors who now saw him as more than just the man with the police background and the German Shepherd. He had become the catalyst for change. The final ruling was clear: the HOA's leadership had acted in bad faith. A recommendation was made to dissolve the board and hold new elections under independent oversight. Walter Green was banned from holding any HOA office in the state for 5 years. Civil litigation was left open for further action. The court also allowed those wrongfully fined or penalized to file for individual claims. James declined to sue. For him, the victory was never about revenge, it was about restoring the idea of fairness. But others weren't so forgiving. A small group of residents joined together in a class action lawsuit. Depositions were scheduled. More whistleblowers came forward. One elderly woman admitted she'd been fined for unauthorized gardening after planting native flowers in her front yard, flowers that attracted bees and butterflies. Another man revealed that his house had failed HOA inspection multiple times because he had an old veteran's flag mounted at an angle not specified in the design rules. Both had considered moving but had nowhere else to go. The reckoning wasn't just legal, it was cultural. Local media followed up with a second round of stories, this time focusing on systemic HOA abuse across the state. Other neighborhoods reached out to James privately, asking how they could protect themselves. Nonprofits began building guides for equitable HOA policies. Within the subdivision, the air was different. Kids played freely again. Families who had once stayed invisible now showed up to block parties and clean-up days. A community garden was proposed and approved. The couple who once received a noise citation for laughter now hosted open mic nights in their garage, inviting residents to share music, stories, and poetry. James was offered a position on the new interim board. He accepted with conditions: there would be transparency, diversity, and regular audits. His first motion was to revoke all pending citations issued in the last 2 years. It passed unanimously. Trust didn't return overnight. But it began rebuilding, slowly, deliberately. Every small change became a symbol. The removal of the private security patrols. The replanting of a tree that had been cut down without permission from a family that moved away in silence. The replacement of the old HOA sign at the neighborhood entrance. The new sign didn't just carry the community name, it carried a motto chosen by vote: fairness lives here. James walked through the neighborhood differently now. Not as someone challenging authority, but as someone who had reminded others what real leadership looked like. He'd come close to giving up. He'd felt the edge of fear and retaliation. But he never stopped believing that justice, real, grounded, human justice, was possible, even in the quiet, manicured streets of suburban America. Reckoning had come. And the ground it broke cleared the way for something better. The storm had passed, but the neighborhood was forever changed. Walls built from fear and suspicion had crumbled, revealing the fragile bonds beneath. What remained was not perfection, but the possibility of something new, a community willing to face its flaws and grow beyond them. James had become more than a resident, he was now a symbol of resilience. Not because he sought glory, but because he had stood firm in the face of intimidation and injustice. The neighbors who once whispered about him in hushed tones now greeted him with nods and smiles. Children who had avoided his yard now waved eagerly, and Rex, ever loyal, became a fixture of local affection. The new HOA board reflected the neighborhood's diversity in ways the old one never had. Meetings became forums of honest dialogue, where grievances were heard without fear of retribution. The bylaws were rewritten to include clear anti-discrimination policies, transparent financial reporting, and accessible complaint procedures. No longer were rules wielded like weapons but shared as tools for mutual respect. Neighbors found themselves collaborating on projects they had long neglected. A community garden flourished on a once-forgotten plot, tended by volunteers who shared stories and laughter alongside the plants. Block parties were revived with renewed enthusiasm, bridging generations and backgrounds. A local artist painted a mural on a retaining wall, an image of intertwined hands, a testament to unity. James refused to forget the scars left behind. He helped organize workshops on conflict resolution and fair housing practices, inviting experts and residents alike. The lessons learned were difficult but necessary. The neighborhood understood that vigilance was the price of justice. Walter Green faded into memory, a cautionary tale whispered in HOA training sessions. His actions served as a reminder of what unchecked power could breed. But the focus was on the future, on creating a place where every family, regardless of race or background, could call home without fear. James and Rex often took evening walks, no longer marked by tension but filled with quiet contentment. Conversations with neighbors became commonplace, and differences once viewed as divides transformed into strengths. The community that had once sought to push him out now relied on his voice to guide them forward. This was not a perfect ending, but a hopeful beginning. The neighborhood learned that true safety came not from exclusion or silence, but from inclusion, transparency, and courage. James had shown them that standing up for what is right could heal wounds far deeper than concrete walls or painted shutters. And as the sun set over the quiet streets, the sign at the entrance, "Fairness Lives Here," stood as a beacon, promising that the past would not be forgotten, but that the future belonged to those brave enough to change it. Thank you for watching this powerful story of courage, justice, and community. If you found this video inspiring, please like, share, and subscribe so more people can hear stories that matter. Remember, change begins when someone stands up. No matter how small the act, it can ripple out and transform entire communities. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed or been part of a story like this? We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and never stop believing in the power of fairness.